Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This episode is presented by Matt Fulton and produced by Chris Carr.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Secrets and Spies. On today's episode, we have another unanticipated chat with Phillip Smyth. As regular listeners know, Phillip is one of the leading researchers for Iranian-backed militia groups in the Middle East. He's come on the show several times now to share his analysis of the twists and turns in the region over these past few months. Following the sudden death of Iran's president last weekend, Phillip graciously joined me again on short notice to unpack what this latest twist means for Iran domestically, for the regime's web of proxies, and for the wider Middle East. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting us directly by becoming a Patreon subscriber. All you need to do is go to patreon.com/Secrets and Spies. Depending on which level you choose, you'll get either a free coaster or a coffee cup. And you'll also get access to our Patreon-exclusive show, Extra Shot, which comes out immediately following each new Espresso Martini episode. Your generosity is much appreciated and helps keep this podcast going. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy our conversation.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Phillip Smyth, we have to stop meeting this way, sir.
Well, stop causing all these crises.
I will try.
You put up these tweets, and this is what happens.
Yeah, it's like it's sort of like Firestarter, you know. Like I don't really have control over my powers. It's starting to be a problem.
I don't know anything about superhero stuff. I'm an adult. Sorry.
Okay, back on track here. I'm not even going to ask you to introduce yourself again. You've been on quite a few times since October 7th, whenever something sort of unexpected and often tragic or concerning happens in the region. I send up the bat signal to you, like immediately. We had that happen again last weekend. So this is now your fifth time on the show.
I'm an ace now.
You're an ace. Yeah, I got to thank you, anticipating this would happen, to thank you. I got a Red Lobster gift card.
Wonderful. I'm going to get some shrimp now.
Well that, yeah. Maybe spend that quickly.
It's so nice that you're looking out, not just for the listeners, but also the guests. I appreciate that.
Yeah, we try to take care of you guys. But
true altruist through and through.
Yes. All right. Back on track again. Let me sort of get us started with what happened, and then we can talk about the how and the why and what it means. So on May 19th, which was last Sunday as we're recording, an Iranian Air Force helicopter carrying President Ebrahim Raisi, Foreign Minister Hussein Amir Abdullahian, and several other officials crashed in East Azerbaijan province. That's in the country's mountainous northwest corner near Turkey, Armenia, and of course, Azerbaijan. Earlier that day, Raisi and his delegation met with Azerbaijan's president to inaugurate a hydroelectric dam along their shared border. Raisi and the foreign minister were in one of three helicopters flying back from the event, Bell 212, and traveled through an area experiencing heavy rain, fog, strong winds, and snow. All listeners will be shocked to learn not ideal conditions for a helicopter. Around 1:30 that afternoon, the helicopter went missing and was first reported by Iranian state TV to have suffered a hard landing. Dozens of search and rescue units went looking for the helicopter. Hours later, with some assistance from a Turkish drone and the EU's Copernicus satellite mapping service, they found the crash site in a forested area on the side of a mountain. None of the 8 occupants had survived. So, Phillip, maybe first tell us a bit, if you can, who Raisi was and what his relatively brief career as president was like.
So he actually, this goes all the way back to the 79 Islamic Revolution and kind of the turmoil that went along for a couple of years as Khomeini was really keeping it in place. Through the 1980s, he was well known for executing tons of prisoners. And there are lots of stories about this from people who've survived and kind of left the country. A lot of dissident media covers this, that he would achieve a lot of infamy for his, the fact that he always would like to execute people. And he viewed that as kind of the means to institute his version of justice in this new Islamic Republic. And I could go into more of that, but I think I don't want to flog a dead horse here. I mean, the guy clearly was responsible for a number of very serious human rights abuses.
Well, he had a nickname to this effect, right?
Yes, he did. There's a reason why he has this name. It was almost always a death sentence, a death sentence, a death sentence that would come down, to the point where there was even internal criticism of him, even from people who were allies, that, what's really becoming of the Islamic Revolution? Are we just an execution squad? Which they technically have remained in many ways. But he's considered, I hate to boil this down to this dichotomy of there's hardliners and there's moderates, because it's not really how this works. And also the definition of moderate, I think, is really misunderstood. But when I use the term hardliner in this respect, he was a true believer, number one. Number two, his hands were quite wet with the blood of anyone considered a foe. He was not the most popular guy, even in some of the circles he traveled in, but he kind of maintained that respect for being a radical from those more radical sections. I'm talking specifically about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, which is the overseas section of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Liked him quite a bit, but he was a guy that you would put in place, and this is what Khamenei did, when you want to send kind of that outward face, demonstrating, this is a true believer in the revolution, a guy who is willing to be the least popular, and that's who we're going to be fronting kind of our kind of external face around the region, and in different articles in the West. But in general, I mean, he maintained that kind of the radical attitude. Nothing really changed. And again, when I say that radical attitude, I'm talking, there was obvious public support that he would offer for a lot of the different militias the Iranians backed. And you can see this now. I mean, it's pretty much every single Iranian-backed Shia militia in Iraq, even, Lebanon, Lebanese Hezbollah, some in Syria, have all been putting up their, condolences. And here we're having this condolence ceremony in our hometown in the Qadr province, and this is what we're doing, and this is how it's going to work. So it's interesting how many are bending the knee to kind of show that loyalty to Iran, but are, happily putting his image up, not just because he's the president, but it sends other messages within kind of those IRGC loyalist sections. But this is a guy who's been there from the beginning. He's, old school, old hand. And something I'm getting out of this, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead too much, but we're kind of seeing there's a shift happening simply based on the age of a lot of these people, and also how many have been killed, sometimes in, fighting, but then other times they've just been, killed in accidents and other stuff. Those old hands, that first generation for the Islamic Revolution, is getting quite old. They are getting quite long in the tooth. And a lot of the key leaders who've survived purges, they've survived, internal issues, political ones, you name it. There's a dwindling number of them left. And I don't want people to think that, oh, well, Iran's going to moderate now and it's going to be, a theocracy that we can, have a McDonald's in. That's not really the direction it's going in. Khamenei is still in power now. Remember, Khamenei was essentially given the position in many respects by Khomeini because he was a kind of trusted lieutenant. But then beyond that, there's also a lot of other politics going on in terms of how he became the supreme leader. But he too is part of this old school leadership, the old school that knew Khomeini, that did things in Iran to solidify the revolution. And now you have this new wave of people. And, I had actually written something back in 2012. I think it was called The Battle for the Soul of Shi'ism. And in it was interesting, Khamenei really spent a lot of time on essentially missionary work and educational work. And when you think that, you're like, oh, well, it's just some religious conversion, education, that's wonderful. Not really, because the missionary and religious and education stuff they were getting was kind of the radical version of the Islamic Revolution, which was already radical in and of itself, and kind of placed an emphasis on that. So this new school of people that are coming up, we're talking people who are clerics, people who are in important families. They're not just they're not just educated in this way, but they're also wired into an established network. That means there's other vested interests going forward to be radical like this, to be militant in other respects. And I'm talking, outwardly looking, they're looking to. So there was actually a recent article, I know it was co-written by Suzanne Maloney. I think it was in Politico. I want to say it was Politico. But I think she really hit the nail on the head with this one, where, this is now the direction that things are moving in. Now, why do you have that? You've had, for the Iranians, monumental success for a lot of their militant radicals, the IRGC QF overseas. I mean, look, they were saying back a couple of years ago that, hey, we dominate 4 Arab capitals. Look at us now. They've completely changed the game when it comes to dealing with the Israelis. And so imagine you're having that kind of reflected back on Iran, even where there is a ton of incompetence and a lot of, paint covering rust within the country, but you still have these circles that are, and I described this in another interview as almost Trotskyite in orientation, but then Stalinist in the way that they run the show. And it's a very dangerous picture moving forward as, we're having, octogenarians leading the country forward. And I think, his position within that says quite a bit, or his former position within it says quite a bit.
Just for context here, so Ali Khamenei, who is Iran's supreme leader, he is currently 85. He's been in office for almost 35 years, so he succeeded Ruhollah Khomeini, the Islamic Republic's founder, when he died in 1989. Raisi has been part of the club from the start, as you said. He was only elected/appointed, and maybe we can talk a bit more about that system and how it works. It's a bit of a very carefully tended garden that those elections are sort of picked from. But so he was elected, I say that in quotes, in August 2021. His nickname, though, within the country was the Butcher of Tehran. So just so I understand you here, you're saying that his placement as president is sort of at the time a signal by Khamenei that, like, we're not going to moderate. We don't care what you within Iran think.
Beyond that, it's also, we are the continuance of the true Islamic revolution, meaning there is no quote unquote moderation. No, we are sticking to the line established by Khomeini and established by, or at least I should say maintained by the IRGC. That was really the signal going forward. And then remember, I don't want to kind of dive into the weeds on this one, because this always ends up turning into, whenever you discuss Iranian politics, it's very Byzantine to use that in an ironic sense. And what I would say is, you have different influences now and on kind of government structure and who's getting picked for what. And with that, Khamenei's power base and his own radicalism is supported by the IRGC. He is the supreme leader. The buck stops with him, and from him, the IRGC gets legitimacy, meaning some level of religious and ideological legitimacy, and plus the system essentially works on their quote unquote loyalty to him. But now they have other interests at stake. Of course, they want somebody who's not just going to be loyal to Khamenei. They want somebody who's also going to serve some of their interests as well. But by picking him, that means he was not only satisfying the IRGC's interests and his own interests, but it's that other direct signal. It's a direct signal outward, but it's also a signal inward. And we also have to remember the context of this too. You've had protests by Iranian women that have been ongoing for years now. A lot of violence that went along with them. They used to get markedly more attention in the news than they do now. But, that was another crack in the system. And it's interesting, if you're reading what Khamenei was saying for the past couple of years, he kept talking about, essentially it's a version of what's called West toxification that was used by Khomeini quite a bit. A number of Iranian thinkers came up with this concept. But kind of going forward off of that, he kind of was stipulating, one of the biggest issues that we have here is this cultural inundation from the West. It's really the West that's making these women not want to wear chador or wear hijab. That's really the issue here. And we need to crack down on it. And then we're showing a crack in our society that they are covertly trying to destroy the Islamic Republic in this way. And so there's more messaging that's even on that. It's Iranians who are overseas. Oh, you guys want to support this kind of thing? Well, but guess what? Look who we have, look who we have running the show, technically. Now, when I say running the show, that's also a whole other different ball of wax, because the presidency doesn't really hold that much power within Iran. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's not a very, very strong position compared to what the supreme leader does. The supreme leader, meaning Khamenei, his finger is really on the button most of the time. But I mean, it's interesting in terms of kind of gauging where certain power interests are within the country when certain people are appointed. So you were bringing this up before, a carefully tended garden. I love that description of it. So in Iran, Khamenei and assembly of experts and a number of different bodies have to approve who is going to run for president. But even let's say somebody won, that's
the Guardian Council,
approved.
right?
Yes, the Council of Guardians,
right? Body of clerics who vet candidates for elections and approve. Yes, you can run. No, you can't.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then also Khamenei gets to sign off on that too. So, I mean, let's imagine there's somebody that they technically approve of. Like, let's say we need loyal opposition, and let's say loyal opposition wins. That's kind of sending a bad signal. So we might stuff some ballot boxes here, or we might just say, yeah, but he can't run now. We're actually excluding him because maybe he's going to be too popular. And you see that quite a bit. You see it when Khamenei is often, feels his power or the ideology is threatened because it's part of his job description. And so there are a lot of people in there that sometimes will be allowed to run, and you'll think, oh, well, I guess that's giving some diversity in there, but they've also kind of calibrated this where it's like, yeah, but even if it were a truly popular election, this guy isn't really going to win anyway. So, whatever, we don't need to jury rig it as much. But, I think in part a lot of this, because it really does come down to what Khamenei wants, and it really comes down to what his internal kind of groupings that represent him and also work with him want. You're seeing that direction kind of moving in a less opaque fashion, and now it's pretty overt. And I think with Raisi coming up, it's another symbol of just how overt it was. Because I mean, imagine of all the people he could have picked, and I mean, again, sends its signals and helps bolster a lot of these other networks.
You mentioned earlier the success that the IRGC and the Quds Force have had in the rest of the region with the Arab proxy groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the various groups in Iraq and elsewhere. And I think they have had a lot of success there. A lot of success. Some of it in terms of, if you look at, in the context of like October 7th, like catastrophic success in places where they probably didn't intend to have it. Would you say that runs contrary to the situation Iran is facing at home, where for the last decade or so, there seems to be real fault lines developing? Maybe not to the extent that like the regime's going to fall apart tomorrow. Real fault lines developing where the demographics are not working in are not working in the regime's favor. There's huge economic problems, major discontent. I mean, you have like Iranian agents working for the Mossad, potentially launching operations on Israel's behalf inside the country. Like, that's a pretty bad situation for them.
It is and it isn't. And I think we kind of, I hate saying this and I hate doing it, but I think it's a classic example. Not to give you a reductio ad Hitler, but right up until the end of the war, you still had units of the SS that were killing Jews, shooting them, gassing them, driving them off places. And do you think that maybe that manpower and the ammunition and the skill sets of some of these fighters, meaning the Nazis, could have been used, I don't know, against the Red Army or against, Western allies, the Brits, the Americans, instead of doing that? And I think this is where a lot of Westerners get confused about ideological commitment. And also it goes even beyond that. You don't just have ideological commitment. You also now have a financial commitment too. You have this network that essentially runs the economy there, and it is a moribund economy, heavily sanctioned, and also it's just not functioning very well. And also when you promote ideologues and you promote people who are not just true believers, but loyal to you, you get a lot of incompetence. And I mean, the good example of this was the helicopter crashing into the mountains. That is absolute and total incompetence. So, I mean, look at this, combining that. I mean, one could kind of make the allusion to, I don't know, the French Revolution, with Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake. Well, all these rich IRGC guys you see in the rich kids of Tehran kind of Instagram posts, driving around in Beamers and new Mercedes and living in these palatial mansions up in the hills. But I don't necessarily think that is really concerning them all that much, because again, it comes down to who runs the religious foundations that also run their own private businesses and employ people and get stuff done. Oh, that's the IRGC. It's the bonyads that are attached to very specific clerical networks. Oh, well, who's running a lot of the military stuff that also employs people? And it's the most important aspect for the Iranians right now. Oh yeah, it's also the IRGC. Who can crack down on you quite effectively if you're trying to have a protest? If you remember going back to 2009, the Green Revolution, a lot of these efforts have been stymied. And I think you kind of have there's a despair with a good chunk of the population. But then there's the other aspect of, well, we're just going to keep it running. And, I guess it's just how it is. There's some of that as well. But when you look at it, the top-down approach is very, very IRGC, Khamenei, kind of the loyalists-run operation. It doesn't mean that other people don't have their slice of the pie, but to have a slice of the pie, you have to have buy-in with that system. So there's only so much one can really do. What third estate's going to come up and, burn down the Bastille in this case, or burn down Evin Prison in this case, particularly when it's very, very hard and they've invested in quite heavily in kind of the securitization of the regime. But because you were saying, well, there's Israeli potential of Israeli agents using Iranians that are there and things like that as a sign for how things have become cracked up. I mean, I'm not going to necessarily say that that's a symbol of deeper Iranian problems. I think one of the bigger symbols of it is when you have infrastructure that's crumbling, when you have your president, your foreign minister, and a number of high-level advisors that are on the same helicopter that is not even capable of doing what they were making it do. And interestingly, I mean, this was another classic one.
Flying around that terrain in those weather conditions.
Correct. So take that, but then also there were other little reports that dripped out that the IRGC had actually grounded some of its drone fleet in that area because of the weather. So it's like,
right. So if if an unmanned aircraft is too dangerous for that to go up, why would you put an aircraft with your senior leadership up there?
Correct. And again, I mean, that I don't want that to open the door to kind of the conspiratorial thinking. I think conspiracies and I think a lot of malicious behavior, what looks like malicious behavior, can be described by incompetence. And it's interesting, because here two things can be true at the same time. And one of them is you have a ton of incompetence, a lot of kind of grift, you have a lot of corruption, you have a lot of these issues internally in Iran. It doesn't mean they're not capable of projecting outwards, even if sometimes it's kind of the paper tiger approach. They're still doing it. They're still getting what they want. So sometimes they're more effective in some areas and not effective at all in other areas and are really grasping at straws to get it done. And I think we're seeing that. I think we're also seeing this is kind of after effects of what happens when the people you're promoting into positions of power, yeah, they're true believers, they're loyalists and everything else, but can they fix the car? It's here's my mechanic, he's my son. Great. So, where did he learn to become a mechanic? Well, he's kind of hung around the shop and I gave him a wrench and, whatever. I think he could fix your McLaren F1. It's fine. Like that's kind of what is coming out here. And I think you're going to see that more kind of increasingly as time goes on, but it also demonstrates another thing. Because you've had so many, let's say, successful professionals that have been pushed out of the country, and you have so many people who have been marginalized in a different way. And now what's the only way to rise in that system? Well, the IRGC. So you kind of have this kind of self-replication in a weird way, where if the quasi-competent ones who are left, based on brain drain due to the revolution and a lot of other things that occurred, where does one go? And the other thing I want to get into this, and again, you can stop me if I'm going into another rabbit hole here.
Sorry, I just want to clarify one thing before we get too far from it. You mentioned the Bunyads. They are these quasi state-run, often affiliated with the IRGC, very bloated and corrupt charities and sort of corporate entities. Is that a fair description for listeners?
Yes, but Bunyads also, I mean, they're state-run, but they're state-run because the state is a theocracy. So normally they're supposed to be run via kind of a clerical apparatus, but the Bunyad itself is really, it's a state-run thing. I mean, you're correct on that, but there's kind of these weird little gray zones to it. And it's also kind of an issue of, sometimes it comes down to, just to kind of give a little example here, maybe you'll have a specific Bunyad that's running, jihad in construction. And I'm not talking about jihadism, like there's literally a jihad in construction one that builds stuff. And maybe through one of the clerics that's associated with them, that's how Lebanese Hezbollah gets money ostensibly to, I don't know, rebuild apartment buildings in Dahia. It's when I say it's labyrinthine, I was joking before saying it's Byzantine, but they can be kind of overly complicated just based on kind of familial connections and other network connections and you name it. But yes, the way that they run, they're very, very important because a lot of money, and this also includes donations. So you can donate to one of these charitable funds that's supposed to be employing people and also technically runs as a quasi business. So you have kind of an issue there too. Yeah, but this cleric, he runs this, it's the Imam Khomeini Foundation. Well, the Imam Khomeini Foundation operates directly with IRGC and, runs under Khamenei's jurisdiction and his loyalists. So, you have issues that are like that.
Your comparison with Nazi Germany, I think, actually is really warranted and an interesting way to look at it. I mean, so in this case, the SS is analogous to the IRGC, right? And, in like 1949, as the curtain was falling on the Third Reich, these are both examples of regimes that have gotten totally high on their own supply, that believe their own propaganda, and because of it have these horse blinders on to the reality around them, right? And it makes them incompetent, ineffective, like just fully set on achieving these ideological goals, no matter how unrealistic or harmful the pursuit of those goals are over time, right? So in the case of the Nazis, right, you had at the end there, sometimes like literal children from the Hitler Youth running out in front of like battle-hardened Soviet shock troops, right? And just getting mowed down for nothing. It was the younger people who really still truly believed in that ideology, whereas the older officers and enlisted people, many of which had seen World War I, knew that like the game was over and this was pointless and we're all just, this is done for us. What I find interesting with Iran, though, is that demographic situation is kind of, I think in many respects, shifted. Is that fair? That it's the older people that are still with it, and a lot of the young people are like, no, we're tired of this.
Yes, but that also doesn't mean there isn't a parallel development that's also going on where they're trying to develop their own wings of young people. But in general, yeah, it's the young people are kind of fed up with living under that. They're going to parties, they drink, they want to live kind of the normal, cool Western life. A lot of kind of cultural attributes don't really flow very well with a Shia theocracy that's being imposed on many of them. So you do have that issue. Again, it's another reason why you see Khamenei coming out and talking about the culture war, essentially, and how it needs to be won. Term. Well, that's kind of what it comes down to. But it's I actually would say it's not in any way comparable to this quote unquote culture war in the United States or in Western Europe. But what I would say is he views it as an existential threat to what is going to happen within the Islamic Republic of Iran. But what I would say, you also have that kind of parallel development that's going on where a lot of younger people who may actually be enamored with the regime itself because maybe their father was in it. Maybe their father did something interesting. Maybe they had a family member who was there. Maybe they didn't have a connection. They're looking for kind of, some economic greater abilities, and they join up, but then they become true believers. And I want to give you a good example here, like the perfect example. Qasem Soleimani, the former head of the IRGC QF, meaning the Quds Force, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, he was not an original kind of joiner of the 79 revolution. He even talks about this. He is symbolic of kind of this second wave that happened when the Iran-Iraq War began. He was coming of age. And then what did he do? He joined the IRGC. And a lot of them would join, a lot of people would try to join Artesh if they could, because a lot of them were just drafted in and thrown into the battlefield. But
the Artesh is the regular army, not the IRGC.
Correct. So he didn't do that. He joined the IRGC. But not only did he join the IRGC, but the guy clearly demonstrated a lot of true believer status, kind of status, not symbols, but kind of a status in and of itself. And then also pulled off some of the most successful moves that Iran has experienced in the Middle East. Now, in large part, it wasn't necessarily just because of Soleimani, but kind of getting down to brass tacks here, that's a symbol of, how the regime, its ideology, and its big power brokers and kind of the big kind of power players within it are still pulling people on and still kind of getting newer generations. And every once in a while, you get somebody who's very, very talented at what they do, is a good leader, and also is bolstering people like Khamenei. Even if there might be some personal disagreements, I mean, they're still, on the same team and fighting the same battle. So, I mean, I think that the possibilities there of younger people kind of being radical and at least continuing that form of radicalism is most certainly there. But I actually do want to talk about this. I constantly read this on Twitter and I constantly read it in articles. They're not wrong in saying it, but they're completely missing a key nuance here. One of these things is it's saying, well, they're all septuagenarians, they're all octogenarians, these are all old men. Clearly they're out of touch with everything. And it completely ignores how the system is built. So, initially, when the Islamic Republic of Iran was constructed, to attain the position of a supreme leader, and in Shiism, Twelver Shiism, which is what they believe in, it's a Twelver Shia state, to become an Ayatollah, normally you have to be pretty aged. You have to be very well educated. You have to be revered by your other colleagues, other clerics. You have to have a status within there. And guess what? It takes decades and decades and decades. You're not going to see a 20-year-old or a 34-year-old Ayatollah or somebody at least with the religious credentials that are required to ascend in that kind of apparatus. And it's interesting how you juxtapose that to, the kind of Western, where there's a kind of weird obsession in media, for kind of the virility of being young and, having high spirits and being able to get stuff done and address problems immediately. And it doesn't necessarily correlate with the kind of the original concepts for, the Islamic Revolution, Islamic governance. And so again, I mean, I don't necessarily think it always counts against them having older leadership. Also, I'm going to totally use some, what do we call it? Wokeism. Is that it? But I'm going to say something quite
I'll allow it.
Here.
That's fine.
Yeah. I'm going to say something very ageist here. And no, I'm not. But it's in general, we tend to not pay the same respects to older people like some other cultures. And I think in this, no, we don't. But the point I'm getting at is it's just interesting in terms of, well, their system is literally built upon that premise. And we are approaching it along the one of, well, they just don't get it. And then it completely excludes in many cases, the fact that there are also young people they try to bring on, and they also have their own cult of youth and they combine it with a cult of martyrdom. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that they have kind of built their own power base. And I keep using that term quite deliberately so, because that's essentially what they've done. Again, that doesn't mean that, it's totally solid. It doesn't mean that there can't be some levels of changes. However, I do think that moving forward, a lot of those changes might actually be one where they are projecting even more into the region because they feel emboldened, because you're having these kids, again, getting high on their own supply. They are believing the propaganda, and they are, we're going to continue executing. We're going to continue doing what we want to do. The Houthis in Yemen, why don't they just take the rest of the country? I don't understand. Let's just send them some more cruise missiles. It's you never know where that can come out. And it's interesting, Khamenei, who, has kind of, he and his IRGC lieutenants have kind of more carefully planned out their operations in the region. It's just interesting to me that, he's quite radical at his age and was also an original, he picked because he was a true believer. So what does that mean? If you, and you also have this bolstered by, I mentioned the Assembly of Experts. I mismentioned them before. They're the ones who technically pick the next Khamenei, the next supreme leader. All of these guys are true loyalists to Khamenei. They are also, true believers in the system. And they have a vested interest in maintaining some form of that. I mean, it even went forward where so-called reformers like Rafsanjani and a few other people thought it was a smart idea to bolster Khamenei because he was in a weaker status and they could get more power. Well, because he wasn't a true Ayatollah. He was not a marja, meaning he was not of kind of high-ranking status to the point where he's highly recognized and his advice can be followed through on. He couldn't really attain that, and it's almost like it's just kind of a afterthought. And that's not really how the Islamic governance system, Islamic Republic, should really work. But what I'm getting at is, if you're having these people processing through, you're now having the rankings not considered as highly anymore. They want somebody who's loyal to the regime, meaning loyal to that system of governance. What do you get from that? Obviously you're going to want somebody who's the most loyal and can guide the country through and protect your interests, which does not necessarily say you're going to get somebody who's quite moderate and going to do the right thing.
The regime was sort of founded and has been, led for the past, few decades by this, principle. It's called Wilayatu Faqih, which translates to guardianship of the Islamic jurist. In layman's terms, could you explain what that is and how it functions within Iran?
Sure. One of my favorite accomplishments was to introduce this into militia analysis because very few people were looking at it before. And so I'm like, yeah, but does it believe in absolute wilayat al-faqih? So let me explain absolute wilayat al-faqih. And we have to preface this with absolute wilayat al-faqih because wilayat al-faqih is a concept that exists in Twelver Shi'ism. It also exists in a lot of other forms of Shi'ism where, and this is kind of the baseline of it, a cleric can take responsibility for, let's say, an orphan, or let's say somebody who is diseased, a widow, and provide aid to them and provide guidance and structure and kind of offer some kind of controlling mechanisms. People who are mentally ill or people with an extraordinarily low IQ kind of thing, they would come in and say, well, we can run this center and you can come here and it's under the management of this Ayatollah, my Hujat al-Islam, meaning it's another medium level cleric, and he'll oversee this and he'll do this. So that's initially where the concept was quasi-grown from. That's the more kind of quietist model, the more traditional Shia model. It's not necessarily a model of governance. It became a model of governance because Khomeini and a number of other clerics, but Khomeini was really the one who pushed it the hardest. And this came from different influences. One, you had the Dalwa party, which had formed and included a lot of Shia clerics, also some Sunni ones too, that were looking for a new system to preserve Islam because they were worried about communism's infiltration. They were worried about the West and West toxification. And so what they did was, okay, well then we need to extend this concept of wilayat al-faqih, of protection. That's what it is. And we are the jurisprudence. We're the jurisprudence here. So we are the ones who can best execute Allah's law that he's given to us in Quran. And we can best do that. And we need to be the overseers and protectors of the entire population until, in the Shia sense, until Imam al-Mahdi, who's kind of their messianic figure who comes back kind of like Jesus.
This is their apocalyptic end times kind of story, yes. Their book of Revelation, 100%. Essentially.
Yes, it is 100% an apocalyptic concept for the ideology. I mean, actually, Khamenei is essentially the agent of Imam al-Mahdi on earth. So think of it kind of like there's a mixture of kind of pope, kind of a papal authority kind of figure kind of modeling there. But again, that's kind of what it comes down to. Now, in absolute wilayat al-faqih, you're probably seeing, well, but they're an Islamic republic. They have a republic. Well, they're very anti-democratic. In fact, Khomeini discussed this quite a bit. And then beyond that, the republic itself, anything that's kind of made there can be overwritten by the supreme leader because literally I've compared it to like the Hebrew National ad. If you want some more irony in here. So the Hebrew National ad is, we answer to a higher power. And it's essentially how this is executed. So with absolute wilayat al-faqih, at the end of the day, to kind of really summarize it, if I am an adherent to it, obviously in this case, I am going to be adhering to Khamenei, who I will also call Imam Khamenei. You'll notice that Khomeini was called Imam Khomeini. Why is that? They go back to the 12 imams who were kind of correctly chosen figures to lead Islam, in this case, Shia Islam. And they're viewing that as these people are extensions of that line of people who were, martyred and kind of put into power because of, familial and religious connections a couple hundred years ago. So they have that. The other part of this is, let's say I'm an adherent. What does it mean? And I run into this problem a lot because if you're trying to describe like how Shia militias work and say they adhere to absolute wilayat al-faqih, I think there was a false impression that happened, and I just remember this, where some people thought that just meant you press the button, Khamenei says go, you go, how high do you jump? It doesn't always work that way. However, the concept of it is political guidance, social guidance, religious guidance, all comes down to essentially what comes out of Khamenei's office. That's where it comes. Now, here's the funny thing. You can still be a believer in absolute wilayat al-faqih, not really be an adherent to Khamenei, but there are other clerics who are under Khamenei who adhere to absolute wilayat al-faqih. So, for instance, Ayatollah Ha'ari, he was a guy who was along with Mohammed Sadiq Sadr in Iraq, and a lot of the Sadrists would look to him kind of early in the 2000s, but he is an adherent to absolute wilayat al-faqih. Is he an Ayatollah? Yes. Is he sometimes considered almost a grand Ayatollah? Yes, which is kind of a very, very high presence. Yet he's still technically ranked in this system beneath the supreme leader. I mean, it's interesting. There's another example of this. Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who is in Iraq, and he is the biggest 12er Shia cleric in the world. He's essentially like the Queen Mother when it comes to 12er Shiism. Somehow he's survived. He lives in Najaf, and his representatives kind of cast his views. He is more of the quietist sense of cleric, meaning he's not. I was going to ask you to talk
about that.
No. So the thing is, and this is actually what how much have I written about this? It's funny because I feel like I'm stumbling over myself because I want to talk at 1,000,000 miles an hour and just speedboat. So not always the best thing to do. But what I would say is, so with Sistani, he's more of a semi-quietist. So sometimes he gets involved in politics every now and again, but he isn't calling for, hi, I am Ayatollah Sistani, and I am starting the state, and I am going to be the leader, and what I say goes. That's not really how he runs it. And that's not really what he does. It's not how he executes, what he would like. Often his political changes come through statements here and there through representatives, and they're not always that binding, unless it's some other kind of smaller issues. And when I say that, I mean, there's one example that actually happened in the early 2000s where he had put out that, gays should be killed. And even though he is considered, quite moderate and he does not like the Iranian system, it does not like the Iranians, you still get stuff like that occasionally. And there were followers of his who were going out and, try to kill the gays. And of course, the Iranians jumped on that very quickly and used that as an example. But before I get ahead of myself, so you can have somebody like Sistani, who is the most lauded Shia cleric. And oddly, you'll have groups that are pro-absolute wilayat al-faqih, who are totally loyal to Khamenei, and you'll see them with Sistani pictures there. So sometimes they will go to different clerics for certain rulings. Often you want to follow, if you're a 12er Shia, right education, and everything else, you want to follow, one cleric. But you'll often see this where, oh, no, he handles these other religious affairs, but our political affairs are really handled by Khamenei, which is kind of another reading of absolute wilayat al-faqih. Other times they just lie blatantly, and some of these militia groups will just slap his face on the side of one of their jeeps because, hey, no, we're showing how Iraqi nationalists we are, and we're true believers too. See, we're doing this because of Sistani's fatwa, not because Khamenei told us to do it a couple months before he ever said anything. And that was a common thing. I mean, that happened in Syria and Iraq in 2014. I always get another kind of side note on this. I always found it really fascinating how a lot of people would say Sistani and his fatwa in June of 2014, which was to fight ISIS because they had taken Mosul and they were going down towards Baghdad. That's really what inspired people to join, the kind of proto al-Hashd al-Shabi, or the popular mobilization forces, and join these militias. Yeah, meanwhile, the Iraqi Shia militias backed by the Iranians had been recruiting people since early that year, actually late in 2013, to fight in Iraq. And they were also fighting in Syria too, which was a campaign that Sistani did not support. Muqtada Sadr publicly did not support it. And even some of his guys that were culled by the Iranians were sending him over there. So you see there's like this mismatch. It can be very, very confusing at times because there are a lot of moving pieces. And it's very, very hard sometimes to ascertain, well, this guy is an Iraqi and he gets a lot of religious guidance from Sistani, but oddly enough, he is politically loyal to Khamenei even when they butt heads with Sistani. Like, how does that work? And sometimes it just kind of it passes through. It's a bit like, to compare it to the Catholic Church, you can have different different bishops that are far more liberal than what the Vatican wants, that are in power in that small section that that they're running. But meanwhile, there's still adherence to the Pope. And again, it's not an exact match. In fact, it's kind of a very harsh comparison in terms of how it's actually run. But I don't want anyone to think that it's like, he asked me to put the Godfather line. He asked me to push a button. I pushed a button. There is a piece of that is there, but it's not that's not how people work. So there's always a lot of, gray zone that's kind of going forward with it.
Thanks for that. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more. I wanted to give listeners a good sense of how Raisi's death will operationally impact Iranian foreign policy. So his title was president, but it would be wrong to consider him president in the sense of like a federal system like ours or even a parliamentary system. Can you speak to like what his day-to-day role is and how much influence he has over the coordination with groups like Hezbollah or Hamas?
Well, he functions more as kind of a figurehead that's out there. When I say that, let's compare it to the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader, when he engages groups like Lebanese Hezbollah, or he engages, Asayab al-Haq in Iraq, another militia, he'll often send representatives that are from Qom, meaning one of the holy cities for Shia Islam, and it's in Iran. And he'll send one of his representatives from there, and they'll often meet privately. Or he'll send somebody from the IRGC that will go along. Other times, you might have the president, because as an important figurehead, and you have them meet with some other important state, figurehead or, politician who's also a militia leader, well, that certainly sends another signal, doesn't it? Sometimes it's also the back channel stuff. I'll send the president on that trip and he will talk to a Shia militia guy here. But Raisi was not necessarily going out and saying, here, Khamenei, told me to tell you that you need to bomb the Israelis in, Kiryat Shimona today. That's not really how that worked. But in general, kind of his daily tasks wise, there was also kind of, I want to call it oversight, because that's not the correct term that I want to use. But in their system, they have a number of different vice presidents. You have to think of it kind of like there's a pecking order there too. Mohammed Mukhbar is now technically his successor because he was the first VP that was kind of there. There's a lot of kind of internal politics that kind of happens with this as the presidential position. It's higher than obviously higher than being a mayor, of Tehran or something like that. You have more fingers kind of on the power structure, and also in terms of patronage networks. That's another kind of big thing, not really an official thing, but it's another important aspect I don't really see discussed all that much. But I tend to look at his position to kind of wrap this together. How does it view the Shia? How is he dealing with the Shia militia, but also doing his daily tasks? It is markedly different and similar at the same time to how you might look at an American president. An American president is a figurehead for the United States. You view foreign policy kind of through what they are guiding, even though in Iran, they're not guiding the foreign policy. You can view kind of other aspects to it. What do the American people think if they've elected this president twice? Does that mean they're in a more conservative trend or a more liberal trend? In this respect with Iran, it's obviously they're doubling down on the Islamic Revolution and doubling down on their radical leadership, and they're doubling down on the people who are long in the tooth, who are, quote unquote loyalists, even if they're unpopular. They don't care what you think. So I think that's kind of a more important aspect to kind of focus on when it comes to kind of the presidency and kind of its roles.
Raisi was considered to be next in line to be supreme leader after Khamenei, who is, as we said, he's 85, so he's probably not going to be around a whole lot much longer. So can you say, in the short term, who is likely to replace Raisi as president? And then looking a bit longer than that, what does it mean for Khamenei's succession planning?
So there are elections that are supposed to be coming up in June, and it's interesting for whoever's going to be president. They're going to get the 4-year treatment from that one. And it's interesting. I mentioned before Mohammed Mokhber, who he was the first VP. And if you look at him, and to give this as an example of who is kind of filling the role for the moment, this is a guy who was sanctioned by the EU for missile technology and being involved in that. He's considered a really, really close IRGC loyalist. So you kind of see, there's an interesting trend line here for who they want in power and who is kind of surrounding them. But he's currently technically the kind of acting president at the moment. There's been a lot of talk too, if Raisi was really, I don't want to say on the chopping block, but if he was really going to be the next supreme leader, that's an interesting pick. Again, I said before, he was not the most popular guy, but the IRGC viewed him as a true loyalist, as a true person who could, do the functions and also do them very viciously and probably give them enough leeway to do, fun little things they wanted to do in the region and also internally in Iran. But one of the interesting names that has popped out of here is Khamenei's son. So Ali Khamenei's son, Mujtaba, he's an up-and-comer in a way. And what's interesting here is, and I left this out when you bring this up about the presidency, I've always found it's interesting when you study how Iran has functioned. Khamenei was, I think he was like third. He was the third president for the Islamic Republic. So one can consider it, well, if you've had that kind of position and we've seasoned you, we've seen how you're coming through, we're seeing who you're most loyal to, where you are with the ideology, where you're disagreeing, where you're functioning, where you're going to be next. And interestingly, because of his time there and also his time in the Islamic Majlis, his time in essentially their parliamentary system, and his time as a cleric, as a militant cleric on the battlefields, this is what kind of convinced Khomeini, in part, that, hey, this guy could be some supreme, leader material here. He is a true believer. He's a true loyalist. Now, that's not the case for it doesn't mean that everyone who's been president is like, yeah, this guy could be the next supreme leader, and that's how it works. That's not how that works. But what I'm saying is sometimes there's a process where they essentially kind of they get their seasoning, and then you kind of see where they go. And you see what the supreme leader is thinking, what the assembly of experts might be thinking. And I think this is one of those opportunities, for Khamenei, for somebody who was widely disliked in Iran, and also somebody who was not as well known in the West, save for all the vicious human rights abuses that he had executed. How do you get that person out there, and how do you kind of build it's almost like PR imaging and kind of branding. So there's that part of it there. But going back to his son, back to Khamenei's son, Mujtaba Khamenei. So he is another true loyalist, but he's considered a bit, I don't want to say dim, but he's not considered like the best pick. I mean, one, he's not the best pick because he's Khamenei's kid. Does that not now establish, that there's now kind of an interesting ruling system in the country?
A Nepo baby, yeah.
Yes. But imagine that though. And again, that's another criticism just on the side. I could also have a counter criticism to that criticism. The counter criticism is, interesting, nobody complains about how many people who are of a Sayyid status, meaning they are direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, which is very, very important in kind of in the clerical networks within Shiism. Nobody seems to, to be upset when there's like 3 lines of Sadrs in Iraq who are considered kind of the political and religious leadership for that set of Iraqi Shia. So, I think there's also kind of a misunderstanding there as well. But in general, Iranians are, a lot of Iranians are looking at this and going, oh, so now it's a family affair. Now it's a family operation, and you're handing it off to your kid, who, again, is not widely known for his religious scholarship, and, also not really widely known for a lot of the for more political moves or for the kind of more storied career of his father. And I mean, that one's popped up quite a bit, but I also think it's popped up quite a bit because it's more interesting to talk about him. And I think sometimes you never know who might be put in place by the assembly of experts. And when I say that, it's interesting. A lot of names don't even come to mind for me. And they don't because you'll see chatter of it. Like, you're not going to see, like in Iranian media, you'll get whispers of things like there are hinted ways and kind of these double entendres and triple entendres of kind of referring to somebody and, oh, and this one's in the media more. You're playing the game of Kremlinology here, but do we really think, Anatoly Dobrinin, is going to come up here? It's, who do we think is next? Is it Andropov? Like, I didn't think it was going to be Andropov. He was too close to this section of the KGB. So you never really know, what can happen with that. And I say this, I mean, one can take this on the flip side, to counter what I was saying earlier, that one, maybe because he's a younger true believer who's come through his father's system, a system that his father helped truly develop over the past couple of decades. Maybe that's kind of what the Islamic Republic, at least under Khamenei, is looking for, in addition to kind of protecting familial interest here. But again, I come down to this where, if Raisi was being considered, and I've also seen pushback to that too. I've seen a lot of pushback to that in different sections where, yeah, he was slightly younger. And yes, I mean, it's interesting. I'll give you a good example. Some of the Iraqi Shia militia groups are referring to him as Ayatollah. So Ayatollah meaning, he's kind of a leading cleric, which is interesting given, who was really going to him for, religious guidance or anything else, but kind of elevating that religious sense. Because where did you ever see him regularly refer to that outside of Iran?
It's sort of like calling a PhD student a doctor before they've delivered and defended their thesis.
Yes. Well, Khamenei had the same issue, though. That's the thing.
Uh-huh.
People were calling him Ayatollah, and he was not an Ayatollah. In fact, there's still very little evidence that really he's true Ayatollah. I mean, it's fascinating because you have somebody like Sistani or Najafi or, a lot of these guys in Najaf, even I'm not talking about Muqtada Sadr, but, Muhammad Sadiq Sadr, his father. You look at these people with their scholarship, Khomeini, that amount of scholarship, that amount of time in, no matter how radical their thoughts are or how unradical they are, it's part and parcel to this Iranian system now, post Khamenei. That's kind of what I'm getting at. That, they will elevate these people even falsely to kind of put them in a box and say, yeah, you see, they were really rising and they were really ascending. It was interesting to see it from the Iraqi side of Iranian-controlled groups that were kind of putting it out there. Oh, really? You couldn't just launch that UAV that was going to fly to Israel. You couldn't really just launch that and say it's in memory of President Raisi. No, Ayatollah Raisi. Fascinating. Okay, so there's some religious element here. You're just adding that one on. But every other time I've seen that we always was dealing with Khamenei. Whenever the Ayatollah talk would come, they'd never really officially say it, but some other connected group would say it. It's almost like the fatwa that never really existed, which was, his nuclear arms fatwa. It's interesting. You don't see this in Western media, and you also don't see it published within Iranian media or even Arabic language media, where you'll see chatter. And I want to give this example because I remember this from Syria. Clearly, Khamenei had to give the ruling and press the button and say, hey, we need to send guys over there from my Shia militias in Iraq and Lebanon and a bunch of other places, which means it has to come from the top. That's how it works. By definition, that's how it works. Yet there's no fatwa. There's only one fatwa that really came out from a Shia political leader that was connected to Khamenei, and it came out like a year and a half after they had already been mobilizing and been sending people over there. And there were always kind of these vague mentions in Arabic language of, the supreme leader has given his blessing. This is his taklif shari. It's essentially like an edict coming essentially from God. If you're disobeying the taklif, then you're not doing God's duty. That's how he often gets people to, quote unquote, press the button, religiously speaking. So you'd see mentions of that, but you'd never see the actual document. You'd never see the actual thing. They were always dancing around the issue. And what ended up happening was, it was like, yeah, of course Khamenei issued a fatwa. Okay, but where is it? But see, he didn't really issue a fatwa, so we just don't know. It's just, they were playing that game. Anyway, I'm sorry for kind of going down that little hole, but I see some comparison to this here where, okay, well, what game are we really playing here, guys? What's going on here? What were we setting up this guy for? So I don't know. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine.
So Mujtaba is 54, right? So relatively young compared to the rest of the regime. If he succeeds his father as supreme leader, does that suggest like that Iran has a royal family now? Like, is there some sort of political inertia that, okay, eventually down the road that Mustafa's son will then replace him? Like, how does that just change things?
Well, it's possible that it does, but it's also, I mean, Mustafa has to be put into that position. And again, he's young. He doesn't have anything nearing an Ayatollah status. Where's he been doing his scholarship? He's known for running bunyads and stuff. He's known for running certain charities. But, at the end of the day, I look at it you have to look at it again from like 30,000 feet. 30,000 feet, that is not a good look for the regime as a whole. If they're trying to project outward and say, no, the Islamic Revolutionary Government, this is how it works. We are nothing like the Pahlavis, those royalists who had no skill for doing this. But again, I mentioned this before, familial networks, it's often how Shia clericalism works. It's like the Hakim family. It just kept going down, and then to the brother, then to the brother, and then to the cousin, and then to the cousin's son. So, I mean, it's possible that can happen. It's entirely possible. But again, if we're looking at the original concept of absolute wilayat al-faqih, where first and foremost, in that earlier practice, you had to be a marja. You had to be a grand ayatollah. You had to have those statuses. That's why Khomeini, they gleefully called him Imam Khomeini, because he could pretty much stand on his own two legs for his own scholarship. That's why when Khamenei came in, and he didn't really have that, he was Hujjat al-Islam, again, that mid-level cleric. I mean, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah has the status of a Hujjat al-Islam, which is that mid-level. And then he was kind of ascending up the ranks. Not Nasrallah, but Khamenei. I look at that, and that's a further degradation of what that original form was trying to be, which, again, that's a long-term concern that I'm quite sure Khamenei has thought about. I mean, obviously, he doesn't want to discredit his time in office. He doesn't want to destroy kind of the legacy of Khomeini, or his legacy for that matter, probably more importantly. So then what does that send? If that sends that, any true believer in the revolution who happens to be Shia and connected well, I mean, that's just more of that kind of painted over, rusting paint. Painting over rusting body of like a car. Does it still run? Maybe. But I look at that as there's a lot of larger scale strategic issues for, thinking about the Islamic Revolution if that comes forward. I mean, the other side of it is, does that create a dynasty? Not necessarily. I mean, if I'm trying to carefully parse my words and play DC think tanker here and go, well, I have no conclusions for you. I'll never get in trouble. Actually, you misread my policy advice because I put "and" over here. You just did.
You missed that.
You didn't give enough back rubs to the insurgents. It's like I said. Well, you didn't give an exact number. Well, you can't measure it like that. What I'm getting at is sorry for that. What I'm trying to get at is dynastic power in Shiism, 12-verse Shiism, is not unheard of. Okay, it's not a foreign thing. And I think, some people who will come out and say, well, God, this will be a total destructive thing. I think it's not necessarily halvesies, but, there's a chunk of it where you can make the argument that, well, he is Sayyid. He's coming from, line of Prophet Muhammad. His father led the Islamic Republic, and look at how much success we've had overseas and in solidifying the regime and preserving Khomeini's rule. You can make arguments like this. But I do think that kind of that other outside effect also plays into this too. And then also, if Khamenei has a kid, and let's say that kid, say that kid is
does he have children offhand? Do you know?
I believe he does.
54, but yeah,
I believe he does. Okay. Because that would be kind of part and parcel. It's weird that I didn't know that right off the top of my head. I'm actually gonna have to look that up now. It's gonna bother me. I'm very annoyed by this. Anyway, imagine he has a son, and imagine this son wants to get into the kind of realm of clericalism like his grandfather and like his father. You run into other issues here where, I'll give you a good example. Khomeini did not appoint his son, and a number of his sons were quite prominent. And actually one of them, I actually have the book here. So he wrote the Kawthar. He's quite radical, true believer in IRGC, but nobody was saying, true believer in kind of the more radical conceptions of Khomeinism. And, he was not he was a cleric and he was, in the news every once in a while, but no one was saying, hey, we're going to stick him up there. We're going to stick, Ahmed Khomeini up there. So I do wonder about that, because there was some talk, this might be a successor, a different Khomeini. It's interesting how politics will play at this. So what networks has Mujtaba built himself once his father is gone? I mean, look at it. You want to see another kind of ascension issue? Look at how Bashar al-Assad came up after his father. And in that system, I mean, that was in kind of the Arab, and I call it Arab revolutionary system, like an Abathist system or an Nasserist system. It was very, very hard to believe that, and the kid will take over. And then it just became commonplace that, of course they're going to take over, and, kind of an Arab nationalist type of regime. But for Bashar al-Assad, you'll notice there was a ton of pushback that did actually happen, but the father had laid the groundwork properly so that he could come in there. The old guard would be around him. Some of the old guard that needed to be eliminated kind of disappeared or didn't have an issue. Other people who were loyal opposition and thought that they could escape that position maybe didn't have such a good time. That takes a lot of time and building. And what I would say is, how much has Mujtaba had? That's the bigger question. And now that if Raisi was next in line, which meant a lot of these apparatuses were there, now they have to be reworked in some way. That creates a whole other the potential for a whole other issue in terms of, let's say he ascends to becoming the supreme leader. He's the supreme leader, and yet you have massive sections of the IRGC that just don't happen to like him because they haven't worked well with him, or they don't, value something. So what does he do in return? Does he just give them everything they want? Maybe he pushes against them. Maybe he encourages something else there. Like, there are so many different little dynamics that can really come into play here. But I think we need to really look at where the groundwork is being laid, and it's very, very hard because it's extraordinarily opaque.
I'm sure there is a team of political analysts in Langley right now writing a very detailed profile on this guy.
I am quite sure they've already written it, and I'm also quite sure that it's detailed to a point, like many other analyses.
Yeah, fair. So when the day comes that Khamenei, shuffles off this mortal plane, do you expect the question of who comes next, whether that's, Kendall Roy taking over Daddy's firm or someone else, maybe more qualified? Do you expect that that'll be resolved by then, or could we expect some period of, we don't know what's going to go down?
If we remember back to when Khomeini died in 89, and the ascension of Khamenei in 90, technically he was picked, but technically you had a lot of politicking going on between people who will call, quote unquote, the moderates, a phrase that I hate, and a lot of other people who were, trying to bolster him or take power away or gain their own power. And I can't imagine that Khamenei hasn't learned from that. I can't imagine that he would want a repetition of that for his son if he's trying to secure legacy. And so, I mean, I would assume that the groundwork is probably being laid. I mean, if that's where this is going, I'm assuming that the groundwork has probably been laid, but there's only so much you can do when you have so many years to go. There's only so much you can do when, they've already appointed, one new person to Assembly of Experts, who's also a radical, who's also a true believer, slightly younger. But you see stuff like this. And, I can't help but think, Khamenei has successfully secured his power in the regime. He has. He has done that through empowering the IRGC. He's done that through allowing their overseas adventurism. He has, cracked down on things that IRGC would want to crack down on. I mean, he's kind of stuck to that line, which tells me, he's arguably more important to the regime than Khomeini at this point. Is that fair to say? Khomeini needs to be there as that kind of, he's essentially playing George Washington, but a George Washington that existed in let's say, our living memory. You need that as the figurehead, but as the population's getting younger and younger, and the new blood is coming in and people are dying off, Khamenei will have higher resonance and will have more value to them. Do I think it's quite the same as Khomeini? Well, I mean, think of it this way. I could see a similar process occurring where it's kind of like with Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad used to do the Holy Trinity. It used to be called the Holy Trinity. I still have pictures of the Holy Trinity when they were still up. The Holy Trinity was so he would have his father, his deceased brother, and Bashar. And they would be together, his brother who died when he was speeding outside of Aleppo in a sports car, his father who had, taken over and ruled the country for how many decades, and did his own corrective revolution, quote unquote, and then Bashar, optometrist. And he did that. It was to kind of buoy his legitimacy. And I think Khamenei has done that in many cases. But, being a true believer, you can't necessarily remove Khomeini from that because you yourself get legitimacy from it. But I think as the generations kind of go forward, it's then kind of picking, where do you go? I mean, who says... It's interesting, who do we say was, most historians say was the most important and one of the best American presidents, if not the best? Abraham Lincoln, not George Washington, which is fascinating. What are some of the most memorable presidents? Well, JFK. Well, it's interesting how we look at that and how time, will change things and kind of change the resonance and kind of change kind of the power portfolio. And who do you need there? Well, are we going to see, kind of the Trinity appearance with Khomeini, Khamenei, and Khamenei the younger? It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how if it plays out like that. But again, I think Khamenei right now, in terms of Iran's overseas accomplishments, he has accomplished a hell of a lot more than his predecessor. And I think that's only because, he's had time, they've had a learning curve, they had a lot of failures. Look at the Iran-Iraq War. Khomeini wanted to conquer Iraq. He did. He wanted to conquer Iraq and put all of the Shia holy cities under his rule. That was his main goal. He sacrificed for a couple of years afterwards, tens of thousands of young Iranians to get that. It was kind of the same kind of poor tactics, poor strategy, throw them against the wall, give them a plastic key around their neck, walk over the minefield. They honestly did that. So, I mean, you look at that and were Hezbollah established then? Was a number of, groups in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and other places where they established? Yeah, sure. But they were kind of early networks that still had some level, and I say some level of autonomy, and I don't want people to believe, they're just doing their own thing and they liked Khomeini. But, they were true believers in that system. They were that first wave. And I think Khamenei, what he's brought in, it's now the second wave of being a more formalized military apparatus, a more formalized status as being a power in the region. It's more formalized in terms of the control that you have over the groups, or maybe a lack of control. You know what I'm getting at here, where, they'll play kind of their game of pragmatism here, and that's how it fits Iranian policy. So I would say, that kind of, I want to call it, it's almost fermented in a way. Okay, so you're seeing a lot of these bubbles rising, and you're seeing kind of the beer being created. Is it necessarily done? No. But, which process, it's the argument of which process of fermentation was the most important when making a beer. You're going to have arguments until you're blue in the face over it. And I think it's a very, very similar kind of parallel to this.
It's a great point. Anything else you'd like to add on this that we haven't gotten to yet today?
You know what I wanted to touch on? Just kind of going to my favorite hobby horse, which is the Shia militias. I was mentioning before that they were bending the knee to the death of President Raisi. And it's something I find, I'm not shocked that they were doing so. I'm not one bit. But had you seen this about 10 years ago, it would have been a much more closed kind of thing. We wouldn't have seen as much of it. We maybe see like one report of a ceremony that was held in Baghdad, something like that. But kind of the blatant nature of it tells me a lot about Iran's control over a lot of these groups and what's coming out. I'm noticing kind of the messaging around it for a lot of the major organizations and even some of the minor organizations. All of them are kind of doing the bending the knee and putting their heads down and kind of going, yeah, no, we really liked him. He's a great guy. We really liked him. He's a totally great guy. You know what? We're going to launch a little operation over here for him. He's a great guy. We sent activists to the funeral and they waved our flags. So you can see, we are on side. And I find that interesting as kind of a way of demonstrating how the Iranians are still maintaining, even when they have issues with these militias at various times, a very, very tight net on them. And I think, narrative-wise, I think it's easier now to see more complexity and issues that some of these groups might have with the Iranians. But I also think this is another symbol of how much true control the Iranians really have over them, and how willing how far they're kind of willing to demonstrate that and be public about it. It's more than just putting up a Khamenei picture, on the windshield, the visor that's up there, and driving down with a dushka mounted in the back. I think this is another interesting development. Okay, so you're now having, showing people crying over the death of the Iranian president. Aren't you an Iraqi group? And weren't you saying that you're an Iraqi nationalist group? And, no, but we're brothers together. Oh, by the way, we put up a sign that literally says that we are brothers and everything, and showing a picture of, Iraqi Shia militia commander Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was killed alongside Qasem Soleimani. And in the picture, Soleimani is there. And then you see Raisi sitting in the middle. What kind of symbol does that send? It's a rather blatant display of Iranian control when the Iranian president doesn't necessarily control relationships with these militias, or even foreign policy. And they're not putting any for the FM who was killed. And we didn't even discuss him, so, it's fascinating from that angle. And I think, as a lot of people are kind of getting absorbed into, well, it's far more complex than it's not really black or white. No, it's not really black or white, but come on, let's be honest here. Fascinating that these posters went up within a day, boom, boom, boom. It's all up there. It's not like Qasem Soleimani. It's not the same kind of relationship. And it's being demonstrated as if it's kind of on par with it, or at the very least, they are commemorating it in the same form.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think so much of the context here is that you need to really understand these systems and these actors. It's just very kind of inherently foreign to a lot of Westerners. And that's why I think your analysis here is always so valuable. So I thank you for that. I owe you for all your help over the past couple months making sense of these twists and turns. I owe you a meal and several beverages sometime soon.
You owe me absolutely nothing, and I am more than happy to have a meal and beverages with you. It's fine.
Thank you.
Nothing is owed. Frankly, I wish I were more clear, and then what I'm doing, because I'm discussing it with you, and I can very easily discuss this stuff with you, but I also run into the problem where I don't want to turn into a Gatling gun, which I will choke over my own, I'll choke on my own tongue doing this because I get too excited, and then I forget names of people that I have literally written down 5,000 times in the past day.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, we try to keep the normies along, with the who is this person and what does this group mean. But no, I think you do a very good job making sense of it to people.
I'll quote my mother on this one because I have to leave it with that. I remember my mother read one of the first monographs that I wrote, and she meant this in the best way possible, although it's going to sound really wrong. She's reading it and she goes, "There's too many Mohammeds in this." And you can read that a lot of negative ways. That's not how it's
literally my
supposed to be
mom
read,
reading a draft of my novel, being like, I don't make up these rules. This is just what they call themselves.
Well, in part, I mean, I've learned from this, and it's kind of refer to a body, refer to a this. You don't necessarily need to talk about every cleric, every person, every this. And I so want to, and I'm like, it's screwing me up in terms of how I'm processing it. But hopefully, I mean, the hope that I always have, and I want to pretend that I've been honing it with you, but frankly, I just keep screwing it up because I'm an idiot.
You're good. No,
but I keep trying to do that because it's like I've only listened to myself once, and when I did that, I'm like, okay, but how would the wife understand this? Okay, I know what I need to do.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's okay though.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I will have links to where listeners can find your work and your Twitter feed should they wish to follow you. Great follow. A lot of good, bits of wisdom about the region as they occur. So yeah, thank you again, my friend. Always great to have you with us.
Well, thanks for having me again, and it really means a lot, and always happy to talk to you. So thank you for running such a perfect podcast that it covers a ton, and I love it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Well, until next time, I'll see you.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.